I feel honored here for a special reason. 21 years ago, my other mentor, Jack Kemp, was given the very first of these awards. He loved receiving it. Jack loved quoting Winston Churchill, along with his other political heroes, Abraham Lincoln and Thomas Jefferson. He admired these men because of their dedication to the power of ideas. And he always said that, the power of ideas. Especially the idea that human freedom and equality of opportunity were the greatest forces for good that the world has ever known. 21 years ago, receiving this very honor, Jack spoke of Churchill's attachment to the Declaration of Independence, especially its moral defense of the ideas that he loved. You know, people jokingly called Jack a bleeding heart conservative, but he was effective precisely because he insisted on making the moral humanitarian case for the economics of freedom. His dedication to these ideas is what inspired me, and it has guided my work as a public servant. So I hope you don't mind me dedicating this evening, at least my share of it, to the memory of the late, great Jack Kemp. But we come together tonight under very different circumstances than those which Jack received 21 years ago. In 1990, the Cold War was drawing to a close. The great threat to America was being neutralized, thanks in part to the economic revitalization led by Jack in Congress and President Reagan in the White House. Jack's supply-side revolution laid the economic foundations that were critical to bring down the Soviet Empire. Today, we face a new threat, a gathering storm, whose primary manifestation is the shadow of our ever-growing national debt. This shadow hangs over businesses and workers who face a struggling economy and the rising probability of greater turmoil ahead given our dire fiscal situation. This shadow hangs over senior citizens who wonder whether Washington is making empty promises to them about their retirement. And it hangs over parents, most of all, who openly wonder if they will be the first generation in American history to leave their children with fewer opportunities in a less prosperous nation than the one that they had inherited. We hear rumblings of the storm coming from Europe. We hear the chanting of angry protesters, the shattering of glass, the shouts of lawmakers as fistfights break out in European parliaments. And the rumblings are getting louder here every day, because instead of learning from Europe's mistakes, we're repeating them. Europe is learning the hard way. What happens when you suddenly run out of road to kick the can down? And now its citizens are paying for the consequences of decades of empty promises. Churchill himself put it this way: there are two ways in which a gigantic debt may be spread over new decades and future generations. The right way, he said, would be to make the utmost provision for amortization which prudence allows. The wrong way, he said, would be to aggravate the burden of debt by fresh borrowing, to live from hand to mouth and from year to year, and to exclaim with Louis XIV after me, the deluge. I don't need to tell you what path we are on. It is not too late to get this the right way, to get back on the right path. But there are two components to getting this right. The first is to follow Churchill's advice. Prudently restrain government spending while avoiding the kind of tax hikes that would stifle economic growth. I got to make sure I reach for the water, not the brandy up here. The second is to follow Churchill's actions, to lead by telling people the truth. It's just that simple. To realize that we are not the first to face these kinds of challenges, and to meet our challenges as our forefathers met theirs, with determination and faith in the righteousness of our cause. On the fiscal side, prudent restraint without tax hikes that would hurt economic growth, Churchill was as clear as any pro-growth economist that overtaxing the population is too often counterproductive from a fiscal standpoint. In his first budget speech in the House of Commons, he criticized excessive surtaxes, saying, quote, "The super tax at its present rate constitutes an excessive burden, both on enterprise and on the saving power of the nation. It is an impediment to the creation of that new wealth without which our present load of debt and expenditure cannot be borne," unquote. It is certainly true that if we allow taxes in this country to go as high as they would need to go to sustain the president's expansive version of government, it would cripple economic growth and end up moving us backwards from a fiscal standpoint. As the head of the Budget Committee, I get to have the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, work to run numbers for us. So I asked the CBO a year ago, what will the tax rates be on our children? My wife Janet is here with me this evening. We have a 6, 8, and 9-year-old at home in Janesville. So I asked the CBO, what will the tax rates on their generation be when they're my age? They said, we can do this. We'll get back to you. So they got back to me. The lowest tax bracket today, which is 10%, goes up to 25%. The middle income tax bracket for middle income taxpayers goes to 63%. And then the top tax rate, according to the CBO, the rate that all those successful small businesses pay, that goes up to 88%. And then in the next sentence, the CBO deadpanned, this could have some negative effects on the economy at that time. So even the bean counters in Washington know you cannot tax your way out of this mess. More importantly, we know that tax hikes without meaningful structural entitlement reform will simply chase higher spending until we can't borrow another dime. The problem is empty promises. Each year that the government fails to act, the U.S. government adds to a pile of empty promises made to future generations. And this president has worked to expand entitlements and even create brand new ones. The Nonpartisan General Accountability Office, more bean counters, but to me that's actually kind of a term of endearment. They've done the math. In 2009, they told us that the government's unfunded liabilities, that's promises made to Americans for which the government has absolutely no means to pay. Promises made to today's Americans in 2009 was $62.9 trillion. Then in 2010, that number went to $76.4 trillion. Today, they tell us it's $99.4 trillion. The gap is growing by trillions every year. What that basically means is, if we want the government to keep all of its promises it's making to today's Americans, my mother's generation, my generation, our kids' generation, we would have to just come up with $100 trillion, set it aside, invest it at Treasury rates, and yes, let's not give Ben Bernanke any ideas here, and invest it at Treasury rates just to have the finances for the government to keep the current promises it's making to current Americans. If the government doesn't act soon to put our budget on a path to balance and the economy on a path to prosperity, then we will find ourselves breaking lots of promises to current retirees and everybody else in between. That's the situation that Europe finds itself in today. But we can avoid this outcome. If we have the courage to give the American people a true choice in which path they want to take. Today, we need to take new inspiration from Churchill, the leader, who saw what was at stake in the choices the people of his country had to make. So we are now in our own Churchillian-like moment, threatened not by foreign aggression, but by a titanic fiscal imbalance that has the potential to crush America's prosperity and diminish its capacity to lead the world. Addressing this threat starts with being honest about the perilous position our nation finds itself in. The thing that I've learned after about 14 years in Congress is talking to the men and women I work for in southern Wisconsin is that Americans know we're in trouble. And they're ready to be talked to like adults, not pandered to like children. Churchill, thank you. Churchill had a great faith in the good sense of the British people. This was the source of his ability to inspire all those who had heard him. He didn't merely believe in his words. but also those he was speaking to. He respected them. His optimism helped the English people take on the aggressors abroad, confident that they would prevail. In the darkest hours of World War II, he urged the British to deserve victory. Remember that poster? If the people kept working courageously, year-round, success may not be guaranteed, but if it did come, it would be earned. He knew the people could be relied upon to make the right choices once they knew the facts, no matter how somber the facts were. If there is such a thing as an unforgivable sin in politics, well, to Churchill, that sin was the refusal to tell the people the facts they need in order to act against an impending threat. Quick Churchill story. In the mid-1930s, Tory Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin admitted that he had deliberately withheld the truth about Germany's building up of arms. He did this because the British people were so pacifist that Baldwin thought his party would lose the election to the pacifist opposition if he were to warn of the growing military threat. Churchill was indignant, not just about the lie, but about the insult to the people. For Baldwin to fail in his, quote, duty in regard to national safety because he was afraid of losing an election, Churchill said, was an incident without parallel in our parliamentary history. This was less than justice to the spirit of the British people, unquote. In that same spirit, it is less than justice to the American people to paper over the profound choice we face about the direction of our country. One path leads to debt, doubt, and decline. Unfortunately, that's the path we're currently on. We have piled spending upon spending, bureaucracy upon bureaucracy, regulation upon regulation, until the burden has smothered our economy's vitality. The result is not only a sluggish economy, but a government debt that is growing at breakneck speed. To compound our imprudence, we are funding the debt by borrowing from nations that do not admire our democracy or our freedom. In the early 1930s, Churchill filled his warnings on the growing threat from Nazi Germany with facts and figures which the Baldwin government disputed. Churchill was ignored and dismissed, but he did not relent, and he was proved right. So let me give you a few facts and figures on our own gathering storm. First off, there's no question that the president inherited a very difficult situation, and that this problem has been building for decades. It's not all his fault. But the great disappointment is that his policies have made things much, much worse. The unemployment rate has risen since he took office from 7.8 to 9%. There are 2 million more jobless Americans now than in January of 2009. There are more than 6 million Americans who have been out of work for more than 6 months. 6.3 million people fell below the poverty level in the president's first 2 years. More people are below the poverty line today than in the 52 years that we've tracked it. At the very time when economic stagnation is causing revenues to shrink, Washington is spending dollars it doesn't have on programs that don't work. Between January 2009 and January 2011, spending for government bureaucracies went up 24%. When you add the failed stimulus on top of that, total spending in this category jumped 84%. Earlier this year, the president's budget called for government to spend over $46 trillion over the next 10 years. $2.4 trillion of this explosion in spending is for his new health care law. This law sets up 159 new boards, bureaucracies, and agencies. One of these new boards, something I'm very familiar with serving on the Ways and Means Committee, consists of 15 unelected bureaucrats who have the power to put price controls in Medicare that will lead to denied access to care for seniors. This new board, called the Independent Payment Advisory Board, its recommendations would become law unless a supermajority voted affirmatively to replace them, a high hurdle that raises the constitutional question about whether Congress can legitimately grant this much lawmaking power to unelected bureaucrats. This new law has become the poster child for the rule of man triumphing over the rule of law. The Obama administration has granted over 1,400 waivers to large corporations and unions that had the connections to lobby for them. The powerful discretion assumed by the bureaucrats at HHS to play judge in determining these stays of execution does tremendous damage to the rule of law. Churchill once said, "If you make 10,000 regulations, you destroy all respect for the law." We are there right now. This administration imposed 3,503 new regulations in 2009, 3,573 in 2010, 68 a week, and this year there are 4,257 more regulations in the works. 219 of those regulations coming out of government this year each cost an estimated more than $100 million each on the economy. Look, when the economy isn't growing enough to create jobs for workers, why would government make it harder for job creators? And it's not just new regulations. The lower tax rates that were enacted in the early part of this decade are scheduled to expire soon, at which point we will face major tax hikes across the board in both personal and business income. The top marginal tax rate, that's the one that most successful small businesses pay. 80% of all businesses in America file their taxes as individuals. We call them subchapter S corporations or partnerships, pass-throughs. Their tax rate goes to 44.8% in 14 months. Now the President and the Senate Democrats are proposing a new surtax to bring that top tax rate above 50%. Where we come from in Wisconsin, 9 out of 10 of our businesses file their taxes this way. Meanwhile, overseas, and in Wisconsin, that often means Lake Superior. Countries like Canada, they're going the other direction. Come January 1, Canada will lower the tax rate on all of their businesses to 15%. So President Obama wants it to go to 50%, while our neighbors to the north, who we compete with quite a bit, going to 15%. At a time when exports are one of the few bright spots in our economy, why are we making it harder for our businesses to compete? Instead of changing his failed policies, the president has turned to the politics of division. Instead of appealing to the hope and optimism that were the hallmarks of his first campaign, he has launched his second campaign by preying on the emotions of fear, envy, and resentment. This has the potential to be just as damaging as his misguided policies. Sowing social unrest and class resentment, that makes America weaker, not stronger. Pitting one group against another only distracts us from the true sources of inequity in this country: corporate welfare and cronyism that enrich the powerful, and all those empty promises that betray the powerless. It's disappointing, but it seems that the president is using this politics of division to distract from his record of inaction on our nation's most pressing fiscal challenges. He still has not put forward a credible plan to tackle the threat of ever-rising spending and debt. He's deferred this task to solving these challenges to one commission after another, only to ignore all of their recommendations when they've completed their task. And it's been over 900 days since his party in the Senate has even bothered to pass a budget. The Senate's already saying they're not going to do one next year. So that's 3 years of our government proceeding without a budget because the Senate just decided not to pass one. And the reason is simple enough. The president and his party leaders do not and cannot publicly commit to the kinds of tax increases required to pay for their spending promises, which they refuse to back down from. They don't want you to know the real cost that this government will bring you. This failure to give the country the debate it deserves, it couldn't come at a worse time. The federal debt has grown faster than expected because of the economic slowdown. In about 10 years, the debt held by the public will be equal to the entire economic production of the United States. By the time our kids are my age, CBO tells us that number will be twice the size of our economy. I actually ask CBO every year to model the American economy and the budget going into the future. And so they have this very sophisticated computer model that tracks their projections of the U.S. economy going into the future. 2 years ago, they told me that their computer crashed, the model stopped, it just ceases to continue in the year 2037 because the computer model could not conceive of a way in which the U.S. economy could continue past the year 2037 because of the debt burden. This year, the model crashes in the year 2029. This is an enormous challenge, but it is not without precedent. When Churchill began to ring alarms about the growing threat from Germany, others did not see the danger. Britain's situation deteriorated year by year. The government's response was half-hearted, and its feckless delays made the war that much harder to win. So, he was summoned to save his country. The one man the British would trust. France had fallen. America had not yet stepped forth, and Hitler turned his whole fury on the island nation. In that moment, Churchill roused his people to stand up against the threat and look to the future. A time when all Europe may be freed and the life of the world may move forward into broad sunlit uplands. For us, nothing is more predictable than the danger rushing toward us from the oncoming fiscal train wreck. There is still time to take the actions needed. We can get this right. There is time to reduce the spending, to reform our tax code, to get our debt under control, to restore economic growth and prosperity, and to repeal and replace this president's health care law. And that is exactly what the budget that we passed in the House, the Path to Prosperity, does. It initiates these reforms. Problem is, we lack a partner willing to meet our proposals with equally honest alternatives. The biggest problem is timidity, lack of political will, fear of losing the next election for speaking the truth. What would Churchill think of those who remain in denial at this moment? What would he think of those who believe that the American people lack the character to save our country from collapse? Congresses are elected to promote the common good of our country. And Congress has the power to take control of our nation's fate and to reclaim popular trust in government. We face a choice of two futures. I am optimistic. I'm very optimistic. Because if we give Americans a clear choice, they will do the right thing. As Churchill put it, the Americans can always be counted upon to do the right thing only after they have exhausted all other possibilities. Look, Republicans didn't always get it right. We didn't get it right as a party ourselves. But if there was ever a time to gather our political courage and to reclaim our ideas, it is now. The country is facing a very precarious moment. Your leaders owe you a real choice. Do you want the president's path of debt, doubt, and decline, where the government goes from promoting equal opportunity to equalizing the results of our lives? Or do you want the American idea, the opportunity society with the safety net, dedicated to liberty, equality of opportunity, and upward mobility? It is our moral obligation as elected representatives to give the American people this choice. And if we do our jobs right, then we will soon have the duty and the privilege to make that vision a reality. That's what this is all coming to. That's the crescendo that this ought to lead to. Let it be said of us, as Churchill said of his people in their most difficult hour, we ought to rejoice at the responsibilities with which destiny has honored us, and be proud that we are the guardians of our country in an age when her life is at stake. Thank you very, very much.